Welcome to the No Quit Living podcast. Our primary objective is to motivate and inspire our listeners to never quit. The reality of life is simple. We all fall. We all fail. At times, we get knocked down. The question is, do we get back up? Are we stronger? Are we better prepared to attain the maximum of our potential? Thank you for joining our No Quit tribe. As you go for your greatness today, never quit. And remember, we rise by lifting others up.
Welcome to episode number 375 of the No Quit Living podcast. I am not your host, Christopher J. Wirth. I'm your host, Wes Yee. And today's theme of the day is Never Quit. Our quote of the day comes to us from Dr. Norman Vincent Peale. It's always too early to quit. As the holidays are quickly approaching, and if you're looking for a fun gift, take a look at our new Team No Quit apparel. You can check it out by heading over to positivitytribemerch.com. Today, we're switching things up a little bit. I will be interviewing our host, Christopher J. Wirth. Over the past couple of years, quite a few of our listeners have mentioned or thrown out the idea of turning the microphone around, so that's exactly what we're doing today. I hope you enjoy today's episode. What is going on, everybody? I'm your host, Christopher J. Wirth. No, just kidding. My name's Wes. I'm actually the audio editor of this podcast, soon to be video editor as well. And today we're doing a little bit of a flip-flop. We have Chris as our guest today. So, Christopher, I'd like to welcome you to the No Quit Living podcast.
Super excited and super weird to hear that.
Yeah, you're on the other side of the coin today. But I think the first question that everybody wants to know is, are you ready to positively impact at least one person today?
That's my goal every day, and I know it sounds super cliche, but especially during this pandemic, I think if we all tried to have that positive impact on somebody else, I think the turnaround would be remarkable in many ways. So I'm ready, I'm juiced, and like I said, it's super weird being on this end of the podcast.
I think you'll get used to it quick. And I think we're going to positively impact more than one person today. It's going to be good. So as you know, the number one objective of our podcast is to motivate and inspire our listeners to never quit. And I'm sure the listeners want to know if you have either a no quit story of your own or perhaps a time in your life where you could have given up or given in, but you didn't.
Yeah, I think to echo so many of our amazing guests we've had on our show, the biggest thing for me is which one of the many, and as we've had some incredibly successful podcast guests, I think the reality is that so many of them have fallen, so many of them have failed, so many of them have missed different targets, but they get up, they keep going. And for me, it goes back to kind of right around the time when you and I actually met, is 2017, 2018, and 2019. I went through a really painful divorce. It was almost 2.5 years from beginning to end when it started. I have 3 young kids. And for me, it was almost like right when No Quit Living, the company, the podcast, was beginning to gain traction. It was like somebody from upstairs or the universe was like, you know what, we're going to throw a bunch of curveballs at you. And it was the most challenging time for me personally and professionally. And the reason I say that is whenever you go through a divorce, it impacts you personally, obviously, whether there's kids or not. But then professionally, whether you are an entrepreneur, whether you work for somebody, it impacts you as well because you are being pulled in many different directions. And what I've found is the emotion, the stress, the pressure, the challenge to get up every single day. And I think for me, I went through that 2.5, almost 3 year process. And I felt like I got a PhD and an MBA in not quitting. I think during that time, a really powerful piece for me was this podcast and being able to do it with you and being able to get some of these incredible guests on the show that had insane no-quit stories and had dealt with adversity and curveballs. And I think for me, the time that I went through it, I don't think anybody wants to ever go through a divorce, but what I've learned and I think who I've become and hopefully who I'm becoming in the future really just was from learning to deal with these challenges. And it was the books I read. It was the podcast I listened to. As I said, it was the guests that we've had on here. but it really and truly impacted me because I started to really be intentional with who I was spending my time with, whether that was in person, whether that's virtual, whether those were books and podcasts. And the biggest thing I took away from that is the concept that we obviously talk about a lot in this podcast. A lot of our guests bring it up is control the controllables. And I learned during that process that going through a divorce, there are only a very few amount of things that you actually have full control over. But it's when you deal with those other things, how do you not allow those things that you can't control to just come into your day-to-day activities, into your brain, into your mind? And I'm just really grateful for the incredible people I have in my life, the incredible friends, the incredible guests we've been able to have on our show. And I'm super fortunate to say that a lot of them have become good friends of mine. So a little bit long-winded, but I think this podcast was more along the lines of something for me personally, but also to just share these no-quit stories with so many of our listeners.
Yeah, man. I remember when you were going through that. I'm realizing now that you've never talked about it before on the show before, because we're always interviewing, amazing success stories, successful guests. I think you talked about it on JLD's podcast. So for the listeners who follow that show as well, they might have heard the story, but for a lot of them, this is their first time hearing it. But it really is kind of the perfect podcast to not only be working on, but also listen to if you're going through tough and challenging times, because you've interviewed so many amazing and successful people. Speaking of successful people, how would you personally define success?
For me, that question was so simple when I first started asking it. And I mean that in the sense that I thought it would be yes or no, or a guest saying A plus B equals C. But what I realized is success is not just a straight line. And for me, what I now realize is success is more about giving your best effort. It's more about knowing at the end of the day that you literally put in a great day, whether that's with work or with your family or kids or parents, grandkids, grandparents. It's not about the monetary things. And for me, taking this one step further is when you look back at your life, it's the concept of the legacy is by living a successful life. For me, that's not about how much money you have in the bank account or the size of your house or those things. Yes, obviously the monetary piece is important, but it's about who the person you are and who the person you've become. And so many of our incredible guests have taken it to a further step than that in regards to what success means to them. And I think when I was in my late teens, early 20s, I looked at success as money. I looked at success as fame. I looked at success as the things you have. And now I look at it very simple, is the impact you have on other people. And that's, what we do with our show and what we do with our company. And I think for me, the more successful you are, that means you've impacted more people in a positive way.
Yeah. Yeah. You can be successful at different things in a way. You could be successful monetarily, but you can also be unsuccessful in other aspects of life, like impact, for example. So Chris, if you had to define yourself, but you could only choose one word, what would it be?
I think if you interviewed me literally 50 times in the last 2 years, I think I probably would have given you 50 different answers, which I love this question. And so many of the guests have said that too as well, I think different times. But I would say driven. I really feel that when I do something, I think both my strength and in some ways my weakness is as I go all in. I don't really have that ability to do something, half effort. So I would say driven probably defines me. But again, if you asked me this a year from now or 2 years ago, it might be something different. But today I'm going to go with driven.
Sure. Yeah, I definitely agree with you too, by the way. I definitely think you're very driven. And for today, I think driven is the perfect one word for you.
Nice.
So I know you have a pretty wild morning routine. It's currently 11:18 a.m. here, EST, and I've been awake for maybe 45 minutes now. But Chris has a completely different morning routine than I do. Do you want to share with the audience?
Yeah, I've been awake for 41 minutes. No, yeah, it's interesting that obviously we talked a bit. I wasn't sure exactly what questions you were not going to ask. But for me, my biggest challenge has been my morning routine. And what I mean by that is, to me, I used to think about the word perfect and perfection, where you had to do everything to the level of perfection, or you had to be perfect in every area. And that's how I started off with my morning routine, where I was like, okay, I listened to this podcast, I read that book, this person does it this way. And I became so fixated in doing like 58 things. And what I realized was that I was falling short in like 48 of the 58. So I took a step back and said, okay, what are those things that are really important for me? So not that I don't listen to other people, I clearly do, and I get a great amount of feedback and information from other successful people that we've had on the show and we follow. But for me, it's starting my day with my workout. I think that's just, for me, something that I need to do from a physical perspective, from a mental perspective. So I actually get up every morning at 3:20, which I know sounds super crazy to a lot of people, but I want to preface that it's what works for me. So if you're a 4 a.m., 5 a.m., 6 a.m., if you're a 10:30 like Wes, it's figuring out what works best for you. And I'm more of a morning person than I am an evening person. If I have to, or if I'm working on a project, I can stay up later. But for me, it starts with the gym. Then once that's done, it's going into something that I think is super important for me, but I'll do a sauna and a steam after my workout. And I'll also do a 2-minute cold shower, which I want to preface that it is no way, shape, or form is it fun. There's nothing good about a cold shower, but it's something that I do. And then I do my affirmations. I have a clear planner that I use. We've obviously talked about that a bit. I do my journal, and then I do some reading. And I try to do that first thing in the morning once I get to my office. So from the beginning to the end, because once your day starts, it really starts. And what so many of our successful guests have shared, and I definitely echo and agree with them, is the idea of being proactive with your morning routine as opposed to reactive. And one area that I definitely fall short in is the phone. I have not been able to not touch my phone, but I'm getting way better at limiting what I do with it. I hope in 2023 to get to the point where the only time I ever touch my phone in the morning is if I'm using it for an alarm as opposed to doing anything else. So that's my morning routine, and it's not perfect and it's not about being perfect, but if I have the full time that I can allot to that, I will try to do all that in the morning because it just helps me win my day. And so many guests have said, win the day, win the morning, which I agree. But obviously, once your day starts with work and other things, you get thrown so many different curveballs.
Yeah, I've been working on the phone thing too. It's a lot harder than it seems. Last time I talked to you, you were waking up at 3:21 in the morning though, as opposed to 3:20.
Yeah, I've taken one more minute. I'm actually going to probably move it a minute or two earlier for the beginning of the new year, just because it gives me that extra minute or two or three to get more stuff done before it gets crazy. And I'm glad you touched on the phone thing because it is so much easier said than done.
Yeah, I'm probably like 50-50 on it, if I'm being totally honest. I'd like to get that up to like 75-25, maybe even 100%, no phone in the AM, but we'll see what happens. Also, dude, I've been working out too recently because I sprained my ankle skateboarding a couple months back. I'm back on the board now, but I just need to get some exercise. So I'm also working out at like 3-4 in the morning, but it's not like I'm waking up and working out at 3-4 in the morning. It's like the other way around because my next door neighbor who has a gym set up in the basement, he's also a night guy.
You see, but I'm glad you touched on that because that's something that I think is super, super important. And I'm not going to put you on the spot because I don't think you'll remember it because I sure as heck don't. But there was one of our guests, a female. It was one of the top or the first 30 or 40 episodes. She said the exact same thing in the sense that she doesn't have a morning routine. I believe she had 2 or 3 kids. She actually did everything in the evening because that's when it was her time. And I think that's important to touch on. I'm glad you mentioned that because that's the difference. So, for example, if you're an evening person, which you are, and that's when you really do a lot of your good work. If I was coaching you and you were paying me to be your coach, if I then said, okay, Wes, you're going to now just snap your fingers and you're a morning person and you're going to get up, it might work for a day or two. You might be able to do it for a day or two, especially because you might be paying me. So you're like, all right, I'm going to listen to what this guy has to say. But for our listeners out there, it's finding what works for you. So if you have a shorter morning routine because you have a much longer evening routine, it's finding where your optimal times are and then maximizing that time. So I'm glad you touched on it because that to me is what some of the most successful people do is they figure out what works for them. And yes, success leaves clues. So they might listen to other people or ask friends or people that they respect. But at the end of the day, you have to ultimately figure out what works best for you as opposed to what works best for somebody else.
Yeah, definitely agreed. Like a morning routine doesn't necessarily have to be in the morning. Like a morning routine can be 1, 2 p.m. if you end up staying up to like 4 or 5 in the morning, like I do, to be totally candid. But even though it's not like quote unquote in the morning, it's still like a routine that you do first thing. And everybody should not check their phone first thing.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you mentioned that too, because I think that's an important piece where maybe a listener out there is struggling because he or she doesn't have that ideal morning routine, or maybe they have an afternoon routine that really works for them. Going back to what I said, it's finding out what works best for you. And I don't know if you would agree with this, Wes, but it's definitely something that I've done is I've tinkered with so many different things over the past few years in regards to 20 minutes, half hour, 6 a.m. versus 6 p.m. And I think the most successful people will find those things out by trial and error. And yes, it's good to listen to other people and get information, but I think the most successful people that I know of are the ones that will actually really and truly figure out what works for them by putting in the work and actually physically trying those things at different times of the day or night.
Yeah, 100%. Just optimizing. I read a thing that said, like back in the caveman era, there were people who were wired to be night people who were wired to be morning people. Reason being that back then they were fighting off lions and different predators and animals and stuff like that. So they had to have people who were wired to stay up later to keep watch on the people who could sleep at nighttime. And then the people who woke up in the daytime could watch the night people while they slept in the daytime. And over many, many generations, hundreds of thousands, millions of years, that wiring is still ingrained in certain people. So there are people that are wired to be night people who are wired to be morning people, which I think is kind of interesting. But moving forward, is there something that you're currently reading or perhaps you've read recently that you'd like to introduce to our audience?
Yeah, I touched on it last episode, but I have to say again, we had on one of our last episodes the former NFL All-Pro Eric Wood. His book, Tackle What's Next, is a phenomenal book. If you're looking to tweak or change things personally, professionally as we head into 2023, I would definitely recommend that. And then David Goggins' new book, Never Finished. I just read this book, and not only did I read the book, I'm re-listening to the audio book, and I'm going to reread it, the first book of 2023. We've obviously touched on David Goggins a bunch on this show. Many of our guests have spoken about him. Brent Gleason was on our podcast. He was actually in Boat Crew 2 with David Goggins, if you've ever seen that video when he's basically screaming like, you can't mess with Boat Crew 2. But that book is unbelievable. If you're looking for some motivation to kickstart 2023, it's a pretty easy read in the sense that it's a fast read. It's not difficult to read, but those two books I would highly recommend to any of our No Quit listeners.
Yeah, Goggins is a maniac. We still got to get him on the show.
So to any listener out there, any connection to Goggins in any way, shape, or form, Wes will pay you significant amounts of money to get David Goggins on our show.
But I'm going to use the company card, yeah? What's the book about specifically?
The subtitle is Unhack Your Mind and Win the War Within. He talks about literally just how he takes all those things that have happened to him throughout his life. And he had a crazy childhood with a very challenging dad. His mom and him basically moved away to get away from it. And then he's, I think, still the only person that has gone through 3 different hell weeks as a Navy SEAL. He's now a smoke jumper at the age of 47. So literally he's jumping out of helicopters and planes and things. And all that together, he just talks about how he's taken all that, and instead of becoming a negative or a violent person or acting out, he's internalized it all. And his objective is to become the best version of himself. And I think just the stories he shares, and he's done 240-mile races. I mean, he's broken bones in his feet. I mean, he's done just insane things that, for me, it's not about doing 10 hours more, but something that we talk about a lot in the show is doing a little bit more. Everybody, I believe, can go one more rep. So whether that's in the gym, you could do one more rep. You being obviously in the music space, if you're looking to become better, if I said to you, all right, Wes, now just spend 8 more hours today, that's not reasonable. But if I said, all right, spend 10 more minutes practicing today, and then tomorrow spend 10 more minutes practicing, it's not a huge amount, but if you compound that over 5 weeks, 10 weeks, I think the significant improvement could be astronomical. But it's just a fantastic book. And like I said, it's not for everybody. Goggins is somebody that you have to kind of understand. But the other thing, and maybe you'll agree with this, I think a lot of people will listen to one of his videos or see a video or read a book or see one of his posts, and they'll do that comparison game. And I think if you're ever going to compare yourself to David Goggins, you're going to lose 100 out of 100 times. But I think if you challenge yourself, like, all right, if this guy can do this extra, I can spend another minute on the treadmill. If this guy can go to those extremes, I can probably walk for another 5 minutes. And that to me is just what I love about him, his mental approach to becoming the best version of himself. Yes, he takes it to intense extremes, but I think we all could do just a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. As opposed to getting discouraged by seeing everything that he's doing, instead becoming motivated by everything he's doing. It's so crazy, man. I feel like this guy doesn't even age. You know what I mean? Like he gets older and just does wilder stuff.
Well, he's 47, and in the book he talks about at some point his 1.5-mile run at age 47. He's literally almost the exact same time as when he did it when he was in his early 20s. So, yeah, I think it just proves to you that if you stay active and do that stuff, you can obviously stay in shape and do those things. Not maybe to the level of Goggins, but I think we all look at aging. Well, I can't do it anymore, or I can't. I'm not 25, so I shouldn't do it. Yes, maybe you can't do something at the age of 55 as you can at 25, but you can sure as heck do the best you can at the age of 55.
Yeah, I'm definitely guilty of that mentality as well. Speaking of being 25, this next question, I think I actually wrote it when I was 25, which is kind of funny. But if you could go back and give the 20-year-old version of yourself one piece of advice, what would it be?
It would be embrace failure as a learning tool. I know that sounds like I wrote that out, but to me, it's embracing failure as a learning tool in the sense that my favorite Zig Ziglar quote of all time, which I've probably said 200 times in the show, is failure is an event, not a person. And I think if we are able to take that failure away from being a personal failure and learn and use it as a stepping stool, I think throughout the age of 20 up until now, I think I probably would have looked at those failures or those missteps, not embracing them, wanting to have them, but looking at them more along the lines of, all right, why did I fail or why did I miss this? And most importantly, what can I do about it? And what am I going to do next time it comes about?
Yeah, I'm still in my 20s, barely, but we're still there. I think that's great advice for the 20-year-old myself as well. Because when you're 20, you fail, it feels like the end of the world, but you don't realize that you have all this time ahead of you to look forward to as well. This next question is a lot of guests' favorite question. I think you know what's coming, but Jim Rohn has a famous quote: "You are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with." And with that in mind, if I could seat you at a dinner table with any 5 people to learn from, dead or alive, who would you choose?
It is not only most guests' favorite questions, but I think it's my favorite question too. And I have to preface this as well about it's similar to the one word question. Over the past 3 years, this answer has changed a lot. So my 5 as of today would be Abraham Lincoln, David Goggins, Kobe Bryant, Napoleon Hill, and Jim Rohn. And when I look at that list, 5 incredibly diverse people. I'm super interested how Jim Rohn or Napoleon Hill would actually communicate with Goggins. I also think that Goggins and Abraham Lincoln would be a insane, we could set the two of them next to each other. But then also, I'm excited to see Kobe Bryant communicate with David Goggins because I think the two of them, obviously very successful in their fields, but I think they both have that mentality of just doing whatever it takes to accomplish that goal or objective. So that's my 5, and I think it would be like I said, a awesome learning dinner, but I think it'd be just an incredible dinner to watch those 5 people communicate with each other.
Yeah, we'd have to record it and turn it into a podcast.
That'd be an awesome podcast.
It would. All right, so we got next. You know the rules of it. It's the hot seat questions. All you have to do is spit out the first thing that comes to mind. Are you ready, Chris?
I'm ready.
All right, 3, 2, 1. Let's go. Last meal.
Pasta followed with Cold Stone ice cream.
Ooh, nice. Favorite smell?
Clean laundry.
Yeah, fire. Favorite sport?
Basketball.
Favorite team?
I would say Chicago Bulls, but a very close second. This goes out to my boy Q, is Kansas University Jayhawks.
Shout out to Q. Favorite movie?
A Few Good Men.
Favorite book?
My favorite book, I don't have a favorite book, but my 2 favorite books are Today Matters by John Maxwell and then The 10X Rule by Grant Cardone.
Dope. Favorite app?
Favorite app is actually the Notes app because I get so many different ideas, thoughts, and I've found that things change all the time. And if I don't put it somewhere, I'll forget it. Maybe I'll remember it a week from now, a year from now, but definitely the Notes app on my phone.
Yeah. Do you still keep a notebook as well that you write in?
I do, yep.
So you have both.
I have both. And just because like at the gym or whatever, my phone's always on me, especially because I got 3 young kids. If it's that important, which a lot of times it is, I'll then put it into my actual notebook.
Cool. What is the background pic on your phone?
Background picture is a screenshot of my vision board, actually. So I got some kids stuff, I got some goal stuff, but I couldn't fit it the way I wanted to. So it's like a third of it, and every now and then I'll actually adjust it on the background.
Cool. Favorite quote?
Favorite quote is by Dr. Vincent Norman Peale. It's always too early to quit.
And finally, what is your favorite song that whenever you hear it, you automatically turn it up and rock out to it?
This goes out, shout out to Chris Wilberding and Jeff Forrester. Ice, Ice Baby by Vanilla Ice. I am not ashamed to admit that, whether it's 4 a.m. on the way to the gym or 10 p.m. at night, no matter whenever I hear it, if it's on the radio, on my phone, I 100% just turn it up and rock out to it. And this is another shout out to anybody that has any ties to Vanilla Ice. We would love to have Vanilla on as a guest. So anybody, again, if you know David Goggins or Vanilla Ice, please let Wes or I know.
That would be dope. That song is a bop. Definitely a throwback. Also, I might edit this part out, but I appreciate you actually spitting out the first thing that comes to mind. Like a lot of these guests, when they do the hot seat questions, there's like mad space, and I have to like cut the space and like put it in there and make it seem like they spit it out like first thing.
You can keep that in there. Don't edit out. But you and I have obviously listened to this, and we've created this podcast, so it's so much easier for us because we've heard that question 400 times, and I think indirectly
True, yeah.
You start thinking about like, oh, if I was ever asked this is how I'd answer.
Yeah, that is true. So, Chris, are there 1 or 2 people that you follow on social media, besides myself, that you could recommend that put out inspirational or motivational content that you would recommend?
Yes, so for me, I'm going to just put out a couple. Is obviously David Goggins puts out some great stuff. He doesn't put out a lot at all. And then Ed Milet puts out some really, really great stuff. And I think those 2 would be the ones that I would definitely recommend. The third would be going back to Eric Wood, who's been a guest on our show. He's put out some really good content over the last bit. But again, got to plug some of our past guests.
Yeah, I think those are great recommendations, Chris. So obviously our listeners know where to listen to this podcast. Otherwise, I don't know how they're listening to this right now. But, they got to know you a little bit better during this episode, which I think is really cool. But is there a way that they could follow you and connect with you? Maybe you have a LinkedIn or something. They could follow you a little more personally.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So the 2 obvious websites we touch on quite a bit are noquitliving.com or thepositivitytribe.com. And then on Instagram, people I think we follow and tag, but also on LinkedIn, I'm just my name, Christopher J. Wirth. And I'd love to connect with anybody. And I think going back to kind of how we started this, I've just had some amazing people that we've been on the show. And a lot of them, candidly, I've just gone out and found their website, their Instagram, their Facebook, or their LinkedIn, and just reached out to them. So I would challenge any of our listeners that if there's somebody you're looking to connect with, just go for it the old school way and just get their information and send them a message.
Perfect. Agreed. And the final question that we ask everybody, and you, the host, are no exception, but do you have any parting words to leave with the audience?
Yeah, for me, very simple is whatever that thing that is holding you back, whatever that reason why you're not doing something, I think the concept of just not giving up is something that's so powerful. And going back to my words I shared about failure is don't be afraid of failure. Don't obviously look for it or want it, but if and when you face that failure or you fall short or you miss that target or lose a game, lose an election, it's not about that being a failure in the sense of you becoming a failure. But the Zig Ziglar quote I share all the time is failure is an event, not a person. So any of our listeners, my challenge is if you failed in something recently or if you fail in something coming up, look at that as an event, look at that as a time to make you a better version of yourself. So if and when you encounter that challenge, that obstacle again, you will come back a better version of yourself.
All right. I think that is great advice. Chris, thank you for being a guest on the No Quit Living podcast.
I appreciate it, Wes, and super cliche, but I say this all the time. I know that you and I will connect again soon.
Thank you for listening to episode number 375. I had a blast turning the mic around on Chris, and I hope you enjoyed hearing a little bit more about him and what he had to share with us today. As we are approaching 2023, our challenge to you guys, the listeners, is very simple. If and when you fall short or possibly fail in the new year, don't quit. Don't focus on just the failure, but instead learn from it, grow from it, and become a better version of yourself. And remember, we rise by lifting others up.
And lastly, to our listeners, thank you. We truly appreciate your time, and we hope our episodes inspire you to keep on attacking life and never giving up. To quote Dr. Norman Vincent Peale, it's always too early to quit.